looking at Libeskind architecture, it reminds work of art similar to sculpture, but behind this complexity, what is the role of the studio about sustainability?
Oh, wow. I think that's the one thing I want to address, that design and sustainability are not two separate things. Shaping and forming architecture has to be informed by what is the intention in the context and on the site. Many of our shapes are actually informed by light. And informed by circulation and informed by air, if you will. And I don't mean that to be sort of mysterious in how I say that. I mean it in a very literal way, because it sometimes what gets missed in our work, and sometimes it's also because the way we speak about our work is focused on the story and on the sort of the poetics, and sort of the sort of conceptual work. But there's an incredible amount of practical issues that go into the shaping. I would say more often than not, our shapes are for sustainability. You look at I'll give you an example. We did a tower in the center of Warsaw, right? And the concept of the tower as being the first kind of icon after the Stalinist era, which is in front of the sort of the Stalin sort of cultural palace. The concept was as if the wing of the eagle rises again, right? Because it's sort of the concept is about, let's say, for some people in the audience, it's about, they shaped the building after the wing of an eagle. Isn't that a little bit too artistic or too driven by sculpture? The reality is that there's always two aspects to that story. That shape was created by a sun path. That shape actually comes from a very precise calculation of tracing the sun across the site, because in Warsaw, any new building, especially in the urban setting, has to allow a minimum of 90 minutes of daylight to adjacent residential buildings. So in front of our project was a communist residential block that was like 5 stories tall, made out of concrete. And we actually had to calculate and demonstrate that every single window, including their bathrooms, would get 90 minutes of daylight without any shadowing. So that sun path projecting back from those windows creates that surface. And then the practical side of that form is that it actually maximizes the building envelope. So that arc, if you're looking at the arc here, right? The center of that arc is where the narrowest part of the building is. But because the sun moves in this kind of trajectory, the building is able to come back in this direction and then come back in the bottom direction. So you actually gain space at the top and at the bottom. So that to us is about responding to the environment, and that to us is about using light and air, which are essential components of sustainability, to shape our buildings. And then beyond that, what we've done, I'm just focusing on this, but many of our projects are like that. What we've done is sort of made sure that even in that climate that we would bring in fresh air So we really worked with our engineers because above a certain height, they don't allow you to have operable windows. And so what we did was in the facade system, we introduced vents that would bring in fresh air. And then those vents are on sensors, and that if the temperature drops below or the winds rise above a certain speed, that those vents automatically close. But we also want, I say that because we also believe sustainability is about humanism and not just creating a mechanical space, but creating a space that actually has fresh air and natural daylight. So we just approach sustainability from, I think, from multiple directions. It's not just technology, it's also shape and form and light and air.
Impressive, I can say, of course. The second question. Studio Libeskind pushes towards extreme solutions and formal perfection. When do you decide what kind of technology suits at the best? And when do you choose, for example, steel structure?
There's two sides to that. I think the technology, we believe that if you, to use your word, extreme or radical forms, we actually believe it helps innovate. It actually helps our engineers be more creative. It helps us be more creative. It helps us push the envelope, not in just a kind of a cliche sense, but it helps us kind of challenge what the industry knows. In terms of how we select the technology, of course, it has a lot to do with what makes sense for the form, right? If you have a large cantilevered structure, it's not going to be likely that we're going to use brick, right? So it's most likely a steel structure or a concrete composite structure that is best suited for the form. The other thing that we do is we want to understand and we take very seriously what is available for that market. It's really important to choose the material and the technique that is suitable for that country or that region or that city. So one example, and this is was that we had we do sometimes these sort of complex grid structures that are intersecting lines. And typically we do that in steel. It just makes more sense to do that as a steel structure. So Dresden was done with steel. The glass court in Berlin, in the courtyard of the Baroque building, was done in steel. We did a project in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and of course we drew it as steel. Just because that was the default. And the client came back, he's like, we're not comfortable with steel. We're gonna make this with concrete. And we're like, are you crazy? Why would you do that in concrete? It seems so much more difficult. And to them, it wasn't. It was the trade they knew. They have the labor, they have the techniques, and they did a beautiful job making it out of concrete. So the selection isn't just preference. Selection is also understanding your market or your context, and that helps a lot. Another example was the use of our tile, the Castle Grande tile, in fact. So we have two projects. Both are about the same scale. Both are residential. Both are in major cities, one in Milan and one in Berlin. Typically, when we do a tile structure or a cladding structure, having a kind of a German background, because the office kind of started in Germany, and that's the other thing that I think gets missed, is that we're seen as kind of design architects, but we kind of have a German mentality too, a Swiss German and now Italian mentality, where we really care about details and precision, because the more complex you forms, the more precise you have to be. We assumed that the tile that we were going to use for the housing in Milan would be a range screen. By range screen, I don't know if it's the right terminology in Italy, means it's open joint, right? It means the insulation and the waterproofing is behind the tile. And so that the tile is actually open and air goes through it, right? It doesn't close the envelope, right? And so we assumed that's what it would be. And then again, we realized that trying to find the right labor force, or trying to find the right contractor that felt comfortable doing it that way, was an uphill battle. It was going to be an unnecessary challenge. And accepting and choosing to go with the grouted closed joint system was the best decision we made, because they did it perfectly. There was no problems. It turned out beautiful, and they did it super precisely. But then we used the exact same tile, or a different version of the tile, our design in Berlin. And there, they did not want to do it closed. They insisted on doing it open joint, and we celebrated that, and they did that perfectly. So same material, two different contexts, two very different techniques and solutions.
So we have discussed that obtaining a certain type of solution, as you have shared also in your last answer, only occurs thanks to an extremely precise and deep control also of the execution phases. So I would like to know which was, in your overall experience, the most complex challenge that you have faced in your collaboration with Studio Libeskind.
Oh, wow. That's actually a hard question, because there's so many of them. We just think, it's interesting, you mentioned earlier that you're available to help with the boring parts. We actually don't find that aspect of it boring. We think that's part of the creative process, is the technical solution, right? So we tend not to kind of celebrate the technical part, and we also surprise our clients when we say we insist on being involved to the end. It doesn't matter what is the percentage of our role. If we have 50% of the architectural scope, we don't want to apply that 50% just to the design phases, or just to the first 50% of the design development. We want to apply that 50% throughout all the phases. And we want to have an even kind of collaboration through the execution. And so our drive to stay involved isn't just to get more work, but it's because to us, it makes no sense to ask a designer to create something unique and work with the geometry that we have learned and developed, or different challenging geometries for 30 years, and then expect to take that project and hand it over to a local office that doesn't have the same experience. They may be perfectly professional, they may be very competent, but they don't have the same kind of experience with those complexities. So in every project, we have to convince our client that having us involved in the details is actually a way for you to save money. Because if you might be trying to save a couple of $100,000 on design fees because you think you can get a better deal out of using only local architects, you're going to get hit really hard when the contractor sends you premiums because they're looking at something that looks very unusual and they mark up their prices by 50 or 100%. So we say, and you need us to speak to the contractor because we can show and demonstrate to the contractor that what you're looking at may look different, but it is based on the same techniques and it can be executed with the same materials that you've always used and that you can use. So we may, the client may spend a few $100,000 on more fees, but the project could save a few million on the contract, on the execution of it. So, and speaking of that, this is not in any way, mean to of course be very respectful to Cesare, this is not in any way saying local partners are not necessary and we absolutely love to work and collaborate with local partners. But the way we want to do it to execute these projects, these very complex projects, is that we want them involved from the beginning. And we want to stay involved till the end so that there's an ownership on both sides. Because we want our local architects to feel like they're part of the creative process, that they own this project as much as we do. Because if they feel ownership of the design, we feel that they actually take care of it more and they understand how to fight it. Now, that didn't answer anything specific. In terms of, let me ask you, if I can, what do you see, or which project do you imagine was the most challenging, architecturally or design-wise?
The example of Milan could be a good example.
Milan was, if you want to talk about the master plan, or do you want to talk about specific buildings?
I mean the specific building, perhaps.
Okay. So Milan provoked us to use technology in a very, very unique way. It was, and we ended up using GPS. The contractors used GPS to trace and to point the different angles of the balconies, for example, right? Wow. So you see the very complex sculpted balcony forms, right? It was with the use of GPS coupled with string lines from point to point. So being able to kind of marry very old world techniques and very new world techniques is actually the key to it, right? So we don't assume that it's only computers that know how to do things that are advanced. There's a lot of just engagement with it, and so that allowed us to create these incredibly complex geometries, but using very known techniques. And it also allowed us to create these very sculptural forms without making the buildings very complex to in terms of performance or cost. So the sculpture in Milan is not the building envelope. The building envelope is behind the balconies, and that's a straight extrusion. That's actually a very practical building. If you take the balconies away, it's a very normal and very understandable and very economical structure. And in fact, this sculptural form kind of allows you to do very standard windows and doors behind it. So that was one challenge that I think we overcame, the curvature of the Milan facade and that structure. Of course, I think you can just imagine that was a structural challenge. The fact that, again, in Italy, it's like if we build a tower in New York, is it going to be steel or concrete? It's probably going to be a combination, but most likely it's going to be concrete, steel reinforced concrete. In England, it's probably going to be more steel. In San Francisco, because of the earthquakes, it's going to be more steel. And in Milan, it was going to be a composite. So the concrete columns at the bottom, which are at quite an oblique angle, those are steel encased. So it's a composite structure which has a steel casing filled with concrete. And so you don't necessarily have to choose one or the other. You can also create a hybrid system. And that's what we did in Milan. The curvature of the facade is actually all flat panels. But because the scale and the amount of flexibility, people forget that glass is actually flexible. With the amount of flexibility that the glass unit itself has, you can create that curvature without making custom curved glass. The curvature on the front of the elevation was also smooth at one point, and then it became stepping. And so that challenge started with a technical challenge, which has to do with reflections, right? So that curvature, the engineers were afraid that those reflections would reflect back onto the plaza and burn people. So if you recall, at the time when we were sort of executing the details for that, it coincided with the Walkie-Talkie building in London. The Raphael Vignoli building in London had a curvature that was reflecting on cars, and it had melted some pieces and and it was considered quite dangerous. And so our client and our engineers would not sign off on it. And so we could have fought back and said, no, we insist. We are the authors, we are the artists, and we're the sculptors, you can't change it. We just saw that technical challenge as an opportunity to make a new design, a new kind of, a new language for the facade, and to distinguish the front to the back. And we couldn't be happier with the results. So we don't see adjustments due to technical issues as compromises. We see those adjustments as opportunities to be creative and to come up with unique solutions. And so I think that helped the Milan project. I think it makes the tower even more unique than just the one form that it used to have. I think if you form a group of people and you surround yourself by optimists, and that means including the engineers. We don't think of our engineers as boring people that are crunching numbers. We think of our engineers as an extension of the creative team. You don't have to have the solution at the beginning of the design. The important thing is to allow the design to evolve with the technology. And so we never go into any project thinking that it's impossible. We just go into the project thinking that the solution might be unexpected. The solution isn't always something you can think of before you are, let's say, immersed in the process. So military, the Dresden Museum, it wasn't that much of a challenge. I think, we find that what happens, and we learned this from the Jewish Museum in Berlin. We found that what happened, because the window system and the cladding was so complex, right? We found that after the first initial kind of resistance and fear of how are we going to make these geometries and how are we going to build these windows, and the clients will say too, we found that the workers became so much more engaged and they were so much more precise that it became a source of pride for them to pull this off and to do it beautifully, right? It kind of became an opportunity to make them part of this challenge, and that they were as much part of the architecture as the silly architect who just makes funny shapes and then expects everybody else to deal with the problem. So they were really engaged, and we do think, and I think it's probably could be said about anything in life, that if you're not challenged, you kind of are sleepwalking. And you're kind of just sort of assuming that you know how to do it, and you don't really need to be on your feet in order to do it. You could do it lying down. So I think the challenging geometries produce precision and create innovation.
So we got to the last question. And since you have provided a really broad overview about the role of the architects, on the engineers, and actually of all the actors involved in the project, we wanted from you pieces of advice for the young architects and designers out there and who are attending this course.
Oh, that's interesting. I think there are two things, and I'll paraphrase actually. I get to call Daniel Libeskind my partner, but he's really my mentor and somebody that I have learned a lot, and he's given me not just opportunities, but so much confidence in being able to kind of allow myself to kind of be fully engaged in the design work with him. I think you have to, as a young architect, there are two things that I would paraphrase. One, architecture or any practice that is about building is inherently an optimistic practice, meaning in so many fields, as a writer, as a filmmaker, you could actually have a pessimistic or a cynical approach. You could have a cynical or a dark novel. But in architecture, you can't, because from the very beginning, you believe in the future. The minute you start drawing, it's about the future. The minute you start drawing in constructing, it's about having a belief that there's a bright future and that's why we're going to build. So I think being optimistic and open-minded is super important. And the other thing that I find extremely helpful, which resonates with me personally, is that it's more in your practice, and as you move on through school and through practice, it's more important to have drive than it is to have a goal. I think so many people assume that in order to be successful, you have to have a goal. And then you establish that goal and you try to achieve that goal. And for me, the problem often, which is possible, but the problem often is that when you feel like you have such a clear goal, you may not be open. Your mind or your eyes may not be open along that way for new opportunities and new accomplishments that may be better than your first goal. So drive and optimism, I think, is the only true advice I can give, because the rest of it has no formula. Some of it is just luck. Some of it's about being at the right place and at the right time. Some of it's just about making yourself available and not being too precise about what you think is the ideal situation for you. So open mind, optimism, and drive. I guess that would be my advice to young architects and engineers. Thank you.
Very, very inspiring. Thank you.